Hello, welcome. Today we'll be talking about Mannerism. We'll start by looking at artists that are working in northern Italy, but then we will turn to this stylistic movement known as Mannerism. So some of the questions we'll think about include what themes are unique to northern Italian artists during the 16th century, during that moment of the High Renaissance in Tuscany. What defines the Mannerist style in architecture and painting, and it's a little bit of a tricky definition, so we'll get into what that means, and how Mannerist art relates to the desires of the patrons who are commissioning artworks and architectural monuments. One of the things that we'll explore is this notion of stylistic change. What are the internal and external pressures that cause artists to adopt an entirely new visual vocabulary? We'll start in the north and we'll look at artists in Mantua and Venice, and here you see Giulio Romano as well as Giorgione, Titian, and Veronese in Venice, and then we'll turn to the Mannerist artist in the second half of lecture. So we'll follow on the heels of our conversation of Michelangelo's late style in thinking about the waning period of the High Renaissance, but these artists are also operating around the same time as the Protestant Reformation that we'll look at on Monday's class. And so all of this is going on at the same moment and extending into the mid to late 16th century. Let's start in Mantua. So here's the map of Italy to orient ourselves. So we'll start in the north in Mantua and then to Venice before we head back down to Florence. So here we are in Mantua, and we are looking at Giulio Romano's courtyard for the Palazzo dei Te. A little note on Mantua: like many northern Italian cities, it was ruled by a very powerful family. In an earlier period, Ludovico Gonzaga was the Marquis of Mantua, and he was a great humanist and a patron of literature and arts, and we'll look at one of his commissions from that earlier period in just a moment. His grandson, Federico II Gonzaga, was the person that commissioned this work by Romano, and it's situated within this, what's known sometimes as a pleasure villa for the Marquis. It's this grounds where there are gardens and there are overflowing fountains and pools, and it's meant not as a residential palace, but really as this space of reprieve and of pleasure. And we can see a bit of that intention even within Romano's facade here, which seems quite simple, right? It seems really not terribly interesting, but when we look more closely, we notice that there is a kind of lightness and playfulness to Romano's design. Notice that most of what we're looking at is totally not functional, right? It's called a facade for a reason. That facade means a kind of face or a kind of veil for the building. The columns that we're looking at are really just carved reliefs into the wall. They have no functional purpose. The archways and the pointed lintels here are really, again, just ornamental. They're not there for a functional purpose. And we can see that Romano is being quite coy and playful in referring to the traditions of classical orders and Greco-Roman architecture. But here, kind of taking a slight nod to the fact that his viewers would delight in decoding these different architectural icons, but still nonetheless not having that kind of functional purpose as was indicative in the earlier Renaissance moment. We could compare this too to the vestibule of the Laurentian Library that we looked at in Friday's class by Michelangelo. And one of the things we talked about was the sculptural quality of Michelangelo's architecture and the robustness of it, the confusion and complexity of it when you're in that space, right? Both of these examples, Michelangelo and Romano's, are using architecture as an ornamental and playful device, one that is as confusing and distorting as it is defining the space itself. Let's move inside to the Palazzo de Te, where Romano has made a series of really interesting frescoes. So here we're looking at his fresco Fall of the Giants in the Sala dei Gianti in the Palazzo de Te. And what you'll notice is this complex, overwrought, incredibly detailed an expressive story of the gods overcoming the giants. And what we're noticing here too, in the way that he's conveying this cloud that overtakes the ceiling, filled with this complex assembly of gods, and moving down into the crashing architecture where we see these beings being scrunched and crushed by the falling columns and falling arcades, is this notion of trompe-l'oeil. And we've talked about this term before, but here you see it spelled out on the left. This is a French term which means trick of the eye. Romano's playing with us, right? He wants us to understand this almost as an extension of the room itself and have the experience that the room that we're standing in is literally crumbling beneath our feet. That kind of trick between what's real and what's the illusion is something that makes this work so forceful and so theatrical in the space that we're looking at. And he's also influenced here by a work of an artist who's also operating in Mantua about 75 years before, Andrea Mantegna, who in this work for the Camera Picta is using those trompe-l'oeil techniques on the ceiling. There's a technical term for this here. It's di sotto in su, from below upwards. And so here Mantegna is painting this illusion of an oculus on the ceiling of this painted room, which would have been in the Gonzaga court for the grandfather of Federico Gonzaga. And here we're looking at through the oculus, right, where we see several cupids assembled, the virtuosic use of foreshortening and how he's rendering those little cupids, as well as these figures looking down at us. So Romano is looking back to this more local tradition of trompe-l'oeil and frescoes, and really upping the ante here and making this very theatrical and spectacular installation for the Sala dei Gianti. What's interesting too about what Romano's doing, I mentioned that the Palazzo de Te is this kind of pleasure villa. And in fact, right around the corner from where this fresco lives were rooms in which Federico Gonzaga would take his mistress. It was a place of luxury and sometimes of sin. And it was also a place that hosted Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who might have made connections to this story of the gods overcoming the giants to his own military conquests. So the themes of love and of militarism and of violence here certainly had resonances within the court of Mantua at the time. So moving on now to Venice. We have not spent much time here, but I want to talk briefly about the kind of unique architecture and social and political life in Venice before we move on to a few of the painters who are working in this city. So as you might know, Venice is a port town. It's really the center of an important trade world and became a huge commercial city-state in the Byzantine period prior to the 16th century. And here we're looking at a few examples of architecture in the city. And as you might know, Venice is shot through with canals, and in the city you get around by canoe, and on the left you can see a palace that was constructed in the 1420s for an important merchant family. And what's interesting here too is that notion of the facade, right? That there's three loggias stacked on top of one another, this really beautifully decorated exterior space with lace-like tracery, but that Exterior ornamentation is just that. It's really on the outside. There's no sense of access to the public. It's facing the Grand Canal, and it's really meant for show, a kind of display of wealth that is very typical in Venetian architecture. On the right, we see one example of a building by Andrea Palladio, who was an architect very much inspired by Greco-Roman tradition and really resurrected a lot of the thinking about harmony and symmetry and a control of ornamentation from those classical traditions. And so you can see on the front of the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, the way that he's using those classical orders and Corinthian columns with the pediment on top. And we recognize with Palladio the use of these very simple geometric devices, such as the pediment, the triangle, the dome on top. We'll return to him in later classes because he really is an inspiration for 18th and 19th century architects. But I want to turn now to painting, where a very different style of art is being developed at the same moment that the high Renaissance artists are working in Rome and in Florence. We see works like this by Giorgione, The Tempest. And Giorgione, we know that he died from the plague and produced very few works, fewer than 10. But what he's most important for, what he's most known for, is the development of this pastoral tradition, and particularly of poesia, of painted poems. And what we mean by that is that he's not necessarily referencing any one literary source in particular, but rather thinking about narrative and symbolic resonances within his art that defy easy interpretation. So for instance, in The Tempest here, we have this mysterious scene taking place and unfolding before us. On the bottom right, we see this partially nude woman with a child at her breast. On the left, we see a male figure identified either as a soldier or perhaps as a wanderer in the wilderness. And the scene too is overflowing with this landscape view, a city in the background, and that lightning bolt shooting across the sky. Notice how Giorgione is using color here and the soft blended material of the grassy, mossy floor and the delicate articulation of the leaves on the trees. He's known for this kind of blending of color. This work in particular is an oil on canvas, and oil had always been more popular in Venice than it had been elsewhere in Italy. And he's really using that oil and the properties of oil, of mixing color, of blending wet on wet, to achieve this really delicate and subtle transition from one object to another. This is in contrast to the kind of sharp delineation that we see in Tuscany and elsewhere. And so scholars talk about this as a kind of contrast between the interest in colore for artists like Giorgione and disegno for artists such as Michelangelo or Raphael. And that's a kind of dichotomy that we'll see reproduced again and again as we move forward in the history of art. This interest in color, in modeling, in blending of light and dark, and the sharp delineation that comes almost from drawing. Let's see. And that tradition of the pastoral is carried forward by other artists as well. So we see a few other examples here. In the center, there's a work of perhaps Giorgione, perhaps Titian. We're not sure of the attribution, but again, showing this scene of a kind of golden age of relaxing and enjoying the countryside. And here in the middle, again, we see two musicians, one with a musical instrument at center with these two nudes on either side. It's a kind of meta commentary on the development of art, the cultivation of music, of beauty, of poetry, of even painting. So it's not just that tradition of poesia, but also a kind of reflection on what it takes to make art and the joys of making art. What's interesting too is that in this case, in The Tempest and in the pastoral concert, we see this emergence of the female nude, which is one of the first times since antiquity that the nude has been reintroduced into the sphere of painting. And we'll look at another example by Titian in a moment where that's certainly the case. But the men who are consorting with one another or discussing with one another couldn't seem to care less about these two women on either side of them. So it makes for a really interesting tension and a kind of mysterious question about the importance of the arts, the denial of pleasure in some ways, or at least of the kind of inspirations perhaps that these two women represent as muses, but a very kind of interesting and enigmatic work for sure. On the right, one example of a work by a female artist, so a bit later, right, 1580s, Lavinia Fontana, who was based in Bologna and whose father taught her how to paint. Her husband was also a painter, but actually ended up retiring because she was much more successful than him. She worked for both the papal court and for the Habsburgs as well. Here we can see how she's adapting the pastoral tradition to a scene from the Bible. This Noli me tangere, do not touch me, is a scene of Mary Magdalene mistaking a gardener for, or mistaking Jesus for a gardener. And we see that she's taking the kind of soft golden hues from inspiration from artists like Giorgione or Titian, but incorporating the sculptural solidity of the High Renaissance in the front figure of Mary Magdalene. So there's a blending here of the two different Italian traditions in her work. Okay, continuing on with Titian, here we're looking at the Venus of Urbino, one of Titian's most famous works. And we see at center a figure looking out at us, reclining on a couch, taking this seductive and kind of come hither pose by looking out at us and placing her hand ever so precisely and gracefully on her genitals. A very provocative painting, of course, which became more and more the taste of these aristocratic courts in the Northern Renaissance in particular. So this was a moment where these pictures of female nudes were becoming popular among important court folks in the Northern Renaissance. This work in particular is called Venus of Urbino because it was bought by the Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo della Rovere. And it's not clear exactly if he commissioned this or if it was a work that ended up in his collection. It's possible that Titian is representing a Venetian courtesan, perhaps one even in particular, Angela Zafferti. Or it's possible that it's actually meant to be representation or made in honor of the Duke's marriage in 1534 to the 10-year-old Giulia Verano. And it's hard to see now how that could be the case, how this could be a celebration of marriage rather than a kind of scene of desire and male voyeurism. But there are several references to marriage here. We know, for instance, that the cassone in the background, these kind of trunks which were given on the occasion of one's marriage, perhaps reference that with the two maids in the background as well. The dog, which is a sign of fidelity, but also could suggest marriage here. Or even the flowers that she's holding in her right hand, myrtles and roses, another symbol of marriage. What's really interesting to me here too in Titian's work is the way that he's playing with the composition, right? So obviously this reclining nude is taking up the majority of the foreground, but she's tilted at this diagonal, and behind her we have this overflowing deep green curtain, which creates a kind of blank or at least darker backdrop on the left-hand side, where we open up to the light on the right and to this recession into the background of the room here where the two maids occupy this space. This interest in a diagonal composition and an asymmetrical interest in space really adds to the kind of drama and heightens the narrative of the scene taking place. And the same can be said for this commission, which Titian took on several years before for an altarpiece in the Santa Maria Gloriosa in Venice. So let me talk a little bit about what that commission was. But first note that there's also this dramatic diagonal coming up from the bottom left up to the right, just as I was talking about the use of the diagonal and the asymmetry of the composition in the Venus of Urbino. So again, this was commissioned in 1519, and it was commissioned by Jacopo Pesaro, who was the commander of the papal fleet, and he had defeated the Turks in 1502. So he commissioned Titian to commemorate that victory in this altarpiece, which would have been in the side aisle of the church. It took 7 years for Titian to complete this, and it went through 3 different designs, compositional designs over that time. And in its final version, Titian's really thinking about how a viewer would walk past the scene, how they would see it, where they would be standing. All of that's taken into account here, which is one reason why there's such a dramatic emphasis on that diagonal and a kind of tilting of our perspective. It's possible that the giant columns which shoot up into the sky were added later. So it's interesting kind of thought experiment to think about what this composition would have looked like if we were to remove those columns, but just to focus a bit more closely on the figure group here. So what we're looking at down bottom, on the bottom left, is Jacopo Pisano, the man that commissioned this work. At center, we see Saint Peter, again, the founder of the church, the disciple who was the first pope in some ways, holding a book open with a key at his feet. If we follow that line upward, we see the Virgin and Child here, and she's looking back down, again, confirming that diagonal line, while the Christ Child's looking out down in the opposite direction. So we have this opposing kind of tension and implied line from his vision. There's also a kind of playfulness right here. He's almost stepping out into the air. He's pulling at her veil. She's holding on to him, but there is a sense of that curiosity and enjoyment of this child. And she's, again, kind of taking this motherly action of protection, but also of restraint. This group down below as well is the family of Jacopo Pisano. So what's interesting too is that they anchor either side of this composition, and they have this profile rendering that makes them feel much flatter, less dynamic than the other figure groups here as well. Just to decode the other folks here too, we have a soldier in the background holding a flag with the papal insignia, and also a little tiny insignia of Jacopo Pisano as well. And then this turban figure is meant to be read as a captive of war. Remember, this is meant to commemorate the defeat of the Turks in 1502. But what's so interesting formally and stylistically about this work is that interest in the diagonal, almost X-like composition, the way that he's playing with these multiple sight lines, and the articulation of the figures in this dynamic and moving gesture, especially with the child of Jesus here as well. So there's a kind of stability and regularity that he's taking from the High Renaissance, but interestingly expanding beyond it and even making it more alive and dramatic. And we can see that most clearly if we were to compare this work to something like Raphael's School of Athens, which is a masterpiece of linear perspective and foreshortening and this kind of liveliness of the figures that Raphael is able to render here. But we can see that Titian in this Pesaro Madonna is simplifying the composition, but making it much more dynamic in its assembly, right? So rather than following the kind of harmony and orderly symmetrical composition that Raphael has implemented to organize this these great number of figures here, Titian has employed these much more dynamic forms in order to convey a sense of animism among the figure groups that he's representing. And so that leads us to another artist who's, again, kind of building on the High Renaissance, but extending a bit beyond it. this is a work by Veronese or Paolo Caleri, who uh, claimed, or his hometown was of Verona, hence the term Veronese, but he worked mainly in Venice, and this work is quite representative of the kind of taste and lifestyle of his Venetian patrons, which were known, again, for the kind of splendidness of the city and the pleasure and the pageantry of Venetian life. What we're looking at is ostensibly a scene of the Last Supper, and you can see the figure of Jesus at dead center, but there's so much more going on than just that. It was painted in 1573 for the Dominican monastery of San Giovanni e Paolo, and it shows this very lavish banquet, obviously with this white city beyond, but populated in the banquet scene itself by some fantastical figures, including court jesters, a number of different animals, donkeys, parrots. There's representations of people eating and drinking and even picking their teeth. And all of these anecdotes and humorous inclusions absolutely shocked the monastic patrons for which this was painted. Remember, this is meant for a monastery, right? In fact, it was so horrifying or so alarming that Veronese himself was called in by the Catholic Inquisition. Just to give us, sorry, I meant to talk a little bit about this. You can see the dramatic difference between Leonardo's Last Supper, which has such sobriety and seriousness and restraint, with the overflowing sense of pleasure and of pageantry in Veronese's vision of the Last Supper, which he later changed, I should mention, to the House of Levi, because he ostensibly changed the story to that of a banquet that Jesus was called to at the House of Levi, the tax collector, rather than the Last Supper, because it was seen to be such a sacrilegious celebration of the scene from the Bible. Anyway, so he's called into the Inquisition. It's that papal office that persecuted heretics, and they badgered him with questions about the appropriateness of this scene. And so they ask, and the man dressed as a buffoon with a parrot on his wrist, for what purpose did you paint him on that canvas? And he says, for ornament, as is customary. Did anyone commission you to paint Germans, buffoons, and similar things in that picture? And he says, no, my lords, I received the commission to decorate the picture as I saw fit. It is large, and it seemed to me it could hold many figures. So he, as I mentioned, eventually sidestepped this issue, but this shows us to the kind of height of this moment in the late 16th century, where the church is holding on to its authority and facing the threat of the Protestant Reformation and calling into question exactly the kinds of excesses that Veronese is celebrating here in the depiction of the Last Supper. So something has gone, in some ways, totally off the rails, and that's what leads us here to Mannerism. And Mannerism, the term maniera, just means style in Italian. It also derives etymologically from the word mano, which means hand. And the emphasis here on style, on this kind of artificiality and even grace or elegance in these works, is a distinctive feature. And when I talk about Mannerism, we'll look at some artists that are squarely within this movement of the Mannerist tradition. But it's also a term that we could use to apply to a number of artists, such as Michelangelo and Titian and Veronese, who experiment in some of their works with this more stylized vocabulary. Michelangelo is such a great example, because we looked at the way in which this depiction of the Last Supper is so much a departure from his earlier work, which was much more based in classical traditions and in harmonious proportions of the body. Here, in this representation of God, as we've talked about, we see this extremely exaggerated and overwrought celebration of the human figure above and beyond that which is naturalistic, right? And so similarly in Titian and Veronese, we see this kind of tipping toward something that is much more over the top, much more indulgent in the kind of artistry or art for art's sake even than the High Renaissance would have permitted. It's also, so therefore, anti-classical in some ways. That's a term that we use to talk about Mannerist art, and that simply means too that it's departing from the classical tradition of elegance and repose and harmony, and instead embracing much more kind of extraordinary and over-the-top subject matter. What else do I want to note here? There's one other thing. Okay, yes, this is it. It also emerges really interestingly after Raphael's death in 1520. So there is a historical reason for this as well. Remember that Raphael is one of the pillars of the High Renaissance tradition, and after his death, his students kind of scatter, and it leaves a kind of vacuum in Tuscany in particular, which is filled by this more kind of ornate style. And so for here, we'll look at the work of Pontormo in particular. And the other thing I wanted to note, and it's a great kind of segue into Pontormo's work, is that Mannerism also is often quoting references from the Renaissance and from historical traditions as well, but it almost carries those quotations or allusions over into pastiche, into a kind of sometimes even mockery, right? So we'll see that kind of taking place here in the work of Pontormo and others in just a second. So what we're looking at is an altar or a chapel, excuse me, in Florence. And you can see that the chapel on the left, in which Pontormo's work is installed, was designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. And we now know the hallmarks of Brunelleschi's architecture, the use of that Pietra Serena stone, that gray stone, as well as these graceful archways and the roundels that stand at the transition point between the dome on top of this chapel. So a very harmonious and symmetrical space that's very typical of that early Renaissance moment. But inside of this chapel, we see this work of Pontormo, which by contrast is very visionary and even kind of fantastical in its representation of the deposition of Jesus from the cross. Just want to make sure that I cover everything. Okay, so what we're looking at here, as I mentioned, is the center figure of Jesus being removed from the cross and carried down by a number of youths who are holding both his legs and his arms that are slumping back to the right-hand side, to the left-hand side. We also see the figure of Mary pulling away from Jesus, and the gestures and expressions in which she wears are very, dramatic. And we have that sense, as we saw with Titian, of that really the interest in that diagonal composition, and it's even vertically elongated, right? As opposed to the interest in depth and linear perspective, here we have the stacking of figures, a complicated intertwining of all of these different bodies, and this kind of pulling diagonally that Pontormo is accentuating by the way that the limbs of the figures are pulling down to the left-hand side, and the colors and stacking of figures pulls up to the right, the upper right. So interesting here too with the strange use of color, these pale pastel-y blues and pinks and oranges, which again complement or accentuate the elongation of the body. And you can see this crouching figure here whose back extends and then twists into the legs, which come down to the ground. There is a sense that this figure group is almost floating or levitating above the ground. There's no sense of that gravity that we get in the work of, say, Michelangelo or of Leonardo. Instead, there is almost a kind of hovering and an ascension upwards, which is really quite interesting. It's a kind of dreamy and complicated scene. And he is, as I mentioned, kind of quoting or alluding to earlier artworks. So here's the scene of the deposition represented by Roger Wyden, who is working in the north, and we looked at this scene quite briefly when we were looking at Northern a few weeks ago, but carrying that same tradition forward, the kind of stage-like presence on the left, twisted and manipulated in the hands of Patormo. But he's also looking more locally at works like Michelangelo's Pietà, and here kind of quoting the figure of Christ who is sitting on the lap of Mary with that hand extending down. But what was for Michelangelo an interest in the musculature of the body, the veins, and the proper kind of naturalistic rendering of how a body would be positioned, here is relinquished of that fidelity to the natural anatomy, and rather using the body as simply a kind of decorative device to think about this really ornate and expressive gesture and sinuous line that's kind of being gently kind of carried by these figures, or in this case, kind of carried on his back, right? Let's move on now to Parmigiano, who was a native of Parma, hence his name, and was influenced by a number of different artists, including Raphael and Michelangelo, but also Giulio Romano from Venice. And here we see a scene that's much calmer than Pontormo's, but just as unsettling in other ways. It's a scene of Madonna and Child, a subject matter which we are very familiar with, but so radically different from what we've seen before. In fact, I'll just go right into the comparison with Raphael to think again more closely about the distinction between the High Renaissance and this Mannerist tradition. Parmigiano's work was commissioned by Elena Bairghi, who was the widow of an important figure, Tagliafieri, and this was painted for a family chapel in Santa Maria dei Servi in Parma. And what we're looking at here in Parmigiano's work is this kind of elongation that we saw with Pontormo, and the kind of expressive and non-functional use of the body, right? The way in which the Madonna's leg and knee jut out. Her leg is impossibly long, the toe all the way down here. The neck, of course, is elongated as well, as is her hand. She's Madonna of the long neck. And her robes are spilling out over impossibly into the air. She must be sitting on a throne of some kind, but we can't see any of that. There's no sense of how a body would actually exist in space. She's surrounded by these Cupid-like figures, with one of whose expressions is totally dead and emptied, very cold in some ways. Of course, the figure of Christ on her lap, again, also extended and attenuated, arms reaching out above and below, also based quite likely on Michelangelo's Pietà here. Could not be a further cry from the sense of triangular composition and harmony and balance in the work of Raphael, right? Everything about Parmigiano's work is overwrought, and even in its, though elegant, right? So certainly highly polished and very decadent, but still very disconcerting in some ways in its departure from that naturalistic, orderly, harmonious tradition. There's even some confusion, like this small figure in the background, whose scale makes absolutely no sense with what we're seeing above. That's Saint Jerome there. And it's hard to put together or try to make sense of his relationship to the figure group that we're seeing in front of us. And we can't even necessarily make sense of how these figures are related to the Madonna and Child. Some scholars have argued that this representation of a vessel here on the left is meant to visually mimic the body of the Madonna and suggest that elongation and swelling as the sign of the kind of ideal female figure, and perhaps also reference her fertility as the Virgin Mary. The last artist we'll look at is Bronzino. He the term bronzino means copper colored, and he was a pupil of Pontormo's, the first Mannerist artist that we just looked at. And he was a court painter for the Medici. At this time, the Medici are back in power, and they are dukes of Florence. And in particular, we are looking at the wife of Duke Cosimo de' Medici. That's the third great-grandson of the first Cosimo de' Medici. And here, as you can see, we are looking at his wife, Eleonora of Toledo, of Spanish origin, who married Cosimo at 17, who has this kind of deadened expression, right? There is something about her that's self-contained and aloof and even mask-like. She's hiding her true emotions in some ways, and she has her arm around her son, who is one of 11 children. So this is Giovanni de' Medici. He did not end up becoming Duke, but rather entered the church. He was Archbishop of Pisa and then became a cardinal at age 17. And very unfortunately, 2 years after he became cardinal, he died, as did his mother, from malaria. So in this portrait, Bronzino is perfecting a kind of style that celebrates the opulence of Eleonora of Toledo's dress, the silk and gold brocade that she's wearing, the 2 strings of pearls around her neck. But he's also complementing that with a certain degree of restraint, of that aloofness that is a sign of her aristocratic separateness and elevation. And that effect of kind of this interest in the decorative, in the ornamentality of this work, and the aloof expression, the certainly kind of departing from that naturalistic representation that we saw in the High Renaissance towards a more stylized vision of portraiture is very typical of Bronzino's work. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is that it's actually quite rare for a portrait of a woman to be shown with her son without the male leader of the household. So it shows us that she herself had quite a bit of power, and she too, we know, was a patron of the arts. So this is very much a celebration of her status within the Medici family. Okay, let's end with the strangest of Bronzino's works. We're looking here at the allegory of Venus and Cupid, another secular representation here, and in some ways captures all of what we've been talking about of this Mannerist tradition. What are we looking at? We have 7 figures and 3 masks down at the bottom here, as well as a dove at the bottom left. And the figures that we're looking at include Venus at center with Cupid behind her. And just check out Cupid's strange twisting body. He's here kissing Venus in this very provocative, erotic gesture, his hand gripping her head, his back moving down here, his arm reaching out to grasp her chest, her nipple, and then his body twisting back into the space to the left here too. Again, this impossible elongation and twisting of the body, and Venus holding this golden apple of Paris, that story that launched the Trojan War, and grasping this quiver from Cupid's from Cupid, and holding it with that graceful, elegant pose, not showing the kind of gravity or weight or strain it might take to actually hold an object. So again, a kind of elegance and polish that Bronzino is really interested in here. We have this figure, this kind of playful, impish figure with flowers to the right, who might represent folly or jest or playfulness. We have this curtain being pulled back by this man who represents time or Chronos, and perhaps here this figure on the left of night or truth. We have this strange, moving back down to the right, we have this strange creature whose head is kind of floating in the background, whose hands reaching out with a honeycomb, and whose body turns into a serpent, and whose legs are that of a lion. So this composite mythical creature who's perhaps meant to represent fraud or pleasure. And then finally on the left, in this little alcove beneath Cupid's wing, is a man gripping his hair, screaming in pain. And recently scholars have read this as an allegorical representation of syphilis. So what does this work mean? Well, it's incredibly complex and has this kind of layering of different associations. It could be that it's a depiction of love and the follies of lovers, as this is Cupid and Venus at center. It could be a kind of warning about the dangers of illicit sex, particularly with the rise in syphilis and venereal diseases like that, the disfiguration and hard of this figure on the left, perhaps as a kind of atropoteic warning to the viewer. And the Duke of Cosimo, who commissioned this work, presented it as a diplomatic gift to the French King Francis, who probably would have also relished in this overt eroticism and the flawlessness of Bronzino's execution. So here again, capturing the hallmarks of this Mannerist tradition, doing away with the harmony and balance of the High Renaissance, embracing the kind of elongation and elegance of the figures, but also this bizarre and super strange arrangement with this complex and playful but difficult to understand allegory that's unfolding before our eyes. So to wrap up, we've looked at these three exemplars of the Mannerist tradition. And where I want us to leave this lecture is by thinking about why these styles change. What motivates these artists to move away from the kinds of traditions that we saw with Michelangelo and Raphael and embrace this new visual vocabulary? Is it simply that they were tired of what they saw before? Is it that the patrons themselves changed their taste and wanted different things, wanted the kind of embrace of pleasure and luxury that represented the secular world in which they were living? Could it have something to do with the kinds of shifting political and religious factors in the 16th century, especially during the pressures of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church? That's certainly one factor in this departure for sure. But these internal and external pressures kind of combine for whatever reason to produce this new and bizarre style. And as we'll see in the next few classes, this transitional moment of Mannerism will eventually lead into the launch of the Baroque. And that's where we'll pick up on Friday's class.